Lecture 3, Incentives Matter, the Soviet Factory System. When Nikita Khrushchev was forced from the Soviet leadership in 1964, he was succeeded by Leonid Brezhnev, who headed the Communist Party until his death in 1982. Only Joseph Stalin held the leadership post longer. Brezhnev had been one of Khrushchev's top aides, but he was much more of a party man and a hardliner, siding with the critics who thought that Khrushchev was too soft. He quickly ended the cultural liberalization that had characterized the late 50s and early 60s, and his regime became increasingly intellectually and culturally repressive. Estimates indicate that by the mid-1970s, there were more than 10,000 political and religious prisoners in the USSR. Like Khrushchev, Brezhnev rejected the more brutal methods of Stalin, but unlike his predecessor, he was less tolerant of dissent, using the KGB to infiltrate and suppress any opposition to the state. Soviet influence on the world stage grew dramatically during Brezhnev's administration, the result of a paradoxical policy that pushed détente with the West while at the same time engaging in massive military buildup. By 1980, Brezhnev had committed fully 15% of Soviet GDP to military expenditures. Interestingly, despite the military buildup, Brezhnev was called the peace premier in Soviet textbooks, because the USSR was not officially engaged in war during his 18-year administration, although he was responsible for deploying Soviet troops on numerous occasions, including the ill-fated entry into Afghanistan shortly before his death. Internally, Brezhnev adopted the good old boy strategy of leadership. He stayed in control of the party through political favors, bribes, and an extensive network of corruption. He and the increasingly elderly and ineffective party leadership essentially ignored the need for economic reforms, preferring to focus on the military and the spread of communist power internationally. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he dismissed the Brezhnev years as the era of stagnation, and he criticized Brezhnev's failure to address serious economic problems. A Soviet joke from the 80s illustrates the increasing disdain for Brezhnev's leadership, especially among younger members of the Communist Party. The story goes that Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev are on a train headed through the Urals, when suddenly the train lurched to a stop. Stalin jumps up, strides into the engine cab, shoots one of the men shoveling coal, exiles one of the engineers to Siberia, and tells the other engineer and stoker that the same thing will happen to them unless they get the train moving. Stalin goes back to his seat, and the train begins to move. They travel on for some time, and then, again, the train comes to an abrupt halt. This time Khrushchev says, "I'll take care of it." He finds the engineer bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, and the stoker collapsed on the floor in exhaustion. Quickly assessing the situation, he calls the other engineer back from Siberia and commandeers a worker from a nearby farm to help shovel coal. He returns to his seat, and the train begins to move again. However, a few hours later the train stops. Stalin and Khrushchev look at Brezhnev and say, "It's your turn, comrade." Brezhnev stands up, looks around, pulls down all the window shades, crosses his arm, and announces, "I think we're moving now." While historians and economists now generally agree that the USSR faced serious economic problems that Brezhnev did not address, those problems were not as readily apparent at the time. Externally, the ongoing growth of the military was extremely visible, and internally, there was a brief shift in resource allocation towards consumers, as Brezhnev acted on his commitment to raise standards of living. During the 9th five-year plan from 1971 to 75, priorities switched from heavy industry to light industry, meaning that, for the first time ever, industrial production of consumer goods was greater than production of capital goods. The patience of the people in waiting for the promises of communism finally seemed to be rewarded. While this was good news for Soviet citizens, Brezhnev's move was not supported by the party leaders, and subsequent plans revived the priority allocation of industrial capital over consumer goods. Like all the premiers before him, Brezhnev failed to solve the farm problem. He continued the collectivization policies, agreeing with his predecessors that large-scale organization was the key to greater output, and touting the very real increases in production from his policy of investment rates over 25% in agriculture. As you can see in the charts on the screen, the increases in output were real, but they weren't enough. Soviet farms could not supply enough food for the growing urban population, and the USSR began to import grain from the West. Now, importing food in itself need not be a problem. Many nations specialize and then trade for food, Japan being an obvious example. The problem was that since there was no demand for Soviet manufactured goods abroad, the grain imports had to be paid for by exports of raw materials, specifically oil. Because the Soviet economy continued to grow, albeit at a declining rate, and because getting accurate information through the Iron Curtain was so difficult, Western observers didn't realize how much the underlying weaknesses were being shored up by events in the world market for oil. The USSR had become a major oil producer in the 60s, and in the 70s reaped huge financial benefits from the OPEC crisis that drove up the price of oil. Suddenly, the Soviets had huge increases in revenue, with which to finance things like grain imports. But these were not based on increased production, simply on the higher market price of oil. Eventually, of course, the price would come down, and the windfall revenues that had propped up investment and imports would disappear. But for a while, it worked, and Brezhnev was able to continue to ignore the need for serious economic reform. Throughout this period, the production priorities set by the Soviet leadership continued to emphasize military output, to an even greater extent than they had under Khrushchev. Remember that at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had taken control of a number of Eastern European countries, and the costs of maintaining that control were ongoing. Add to that the growing costs of the Cold War arms and space races, and the Soviets were making serious commitments of their GDP. For a while, it all floated on a pool of oil. But then the Saudis changed course. They began to fear Soviet expansion southward, and they decided that their best interests lay in cooperating with the United States. They decided to increase output, ending the OPEC crisis and causing a rapid fall in the price of oil that revealed the extent of the Soviet problem. Because unlike the Saudis, the Soviets could not readily expand oil production to maintain revenue at a lower price. And while the situation demanded serious reform efforts, Brezhnev essentially chose to take none, to pull down the window shades and pretend to be moving. After Brezhnev's death in 1982, the reign of the old boys of the party continued. Yuri Andropov and then Konstantin Chernenko, both high-ranking officials during the Brezhnev years, served as premiers and died in office. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev initiated a new era in Soviet leadership. We'll use this 20-year time period from the mid-60s to the entry of Gorbachev in 1985 as the context for introducing another tool of economic reasoning, incentive analysis. The West wasn't able to see it very well, but the cracks in the economic leg of our metaphorical stool were widening. We did know about the grain imports, however, and as time went on, we got little hints of problems in stories and jokes that leaked out. Journalists reported things like warehouses full of pink women's boots that no one wanted, but that some minister had seen in Paris and ordered produced in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev complained of chandeliers so heavy that they pulled down ceilings. Store shelves were mostly empty, and some stores only opened occasionally when there was something to put on the shelves. Products were so poorly made as to be virtually useless, or they became useless with the simple loss of a screw or nut because there were no spare parts. These were all incentive problems, and we'll look at them within our contextual framework of Soviet society, moving down a level from the ministry to look at the factory system. In terms of the moral cultural leg, we start to see that in addition to an undercurrent of dissidence, the Soviet people were beginning to express dissatisfaction by making fun of the system. Brezhnev tolerated no criticism and readily tried and jailed dissidents and intellectuals, but he couldn't stop the jokes. Remember that this is a well-educated citizenry, a consequence of Stalin's and Khrushchev's resource allocation choices. And as they gained some access to consumer goods like radios, they were becoming increasingly informed as well. The first cracks in the moral cultural leg are beginning to show, and by the end of the Brezhnev era, the jokes about delays, endless lines, and shoddy products are out in the open. As we look at the bizarre stories about Soviet factories, we'll focus on the person in charge, the director or factory manager, and the incentives that shaped his choices. Very different incentives than those faced by businessmen in market economies. Incentives are rewards or punishments that influence choices and behavior. They can be monetary. We saw how prices act as incentives in markets, but they need not be, and frequently are not. We categorize incentives as positive or negative. Positive incentives are rewards that encourage a particular type of behavior, and negative incentives are punishments. Now note that the same desired behavior can be influenced by either positive or negative incentives. For example, a positive incentive to get up early in the morning is the smell of coffee brewing downstairs in the kitchen. A negative incentive is knowing that if you don't get up, you'll be last in the shower and get cold water. Both get you out of bed early, one by promising a reward, the other by threatening a punishment. Incentives that fail to produce the desired behavior are called perverse. They can be positive or negative, rewards or punishments, just like regular incentives. But they're called perverse because they don't work right, often encouraging the exact opposite of the desired behavior. Perverse incentives aren't created on purpose. They may be the result of very well-intentioned policies. But their appearance clearly indicates that intentions and results can be two different things. Perverse incentives also aren't unique to command economies, although they seem to have had more than their share. We have some classic examples of perverse incentives in our country's history, with welfare policies that awarded payments to poor mothers rather than poor couples with children, or that increased payments if unwed mothers had more children. The goal of the policies was to improve the well-being of the children, but by punishing families with fathers present or rewarding more births, the perverse incentives worked against their stated goals. Now look at reasoning proposition number 3 again. People respond to incentives in predictable ways, which means two things. First, if you want to understand why people behave the way they do, the first step is to identify the incentives. And then second, if we want to encourage people to behave in any particular way, we have to make sure to get the incentives right. The Soviet experience reinforces for us the difficulty of doing this in a centralized economy. We mentioned in Lesson 2, and you're very much aware from your own experience, how price incentives influence consumers' and producers' choices in markets. And we saw that administered prices, like those in the Soviet Union, rob prices of their coordinating function. Well, markets also rely on profit to motivate production, and profit was another incentive that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, because it didn't fit the underlying philosophy of communism. Remember that Marx said that all value derives from labor, and he made no distinction, as we would, between working in the factory, what we would call labor, and running the factory, what we would call entrepreneurship. For Marx, the entrepreneurs, or capitalists, were exploiters. Their labor was no more valuable and they deserved no more reward than the line workers in the factory. Market economies differentiate entrepreneurs from labor because of the risk they assume in gathering resources and organizing production, a risk that laborers don't bear. The reward for successful assumption of a risk is profit. The penalty for failure is loss. But the centrally directed economy of the Soviet Union eliminated the role of the entrepreneur. However, by looking more closely at the role entrepreneurs play in market economies, we can better see how their absence affected the Soviet Union. The entrepreneur is sometimes referred to as the residual claimant. In other words, the residual, what's left over after all the costs of production have been paid, is his. If he's used resources in a way that people value at a price they're willing to pay, the residual is a profit. If he hasn't, the residual is a loss. So profit, then, is an incentive that encourages entrepreneurs to use resources in highly valued ways and to innovate to reduce cost and provide new or better quality goods and services. Production in the Soviet Union was not generated by entrepreneurship. The government decided what to produce and how to produce it. Revenue from sales went back to the government, and the government paid the costs of production, including the wages of laborers of all types. Now, it's true that stores and factories in the Soviet Union, quote, made money. That's in quotes so that we don't confuse it with profit in the economic sense. Yes, we often think about profit as simply revenue minus cost. So we could easily be confused into thinking that if more money came into the state store for the product than went out for the resources, the store or the factory made a profit. But remember that because the prices were administered, there's no sense in which this, quote, profit was an indication of the value of the products or the value of using the resources in this particular way. And since the government taxed away any surplus revenues, these so-called profits didn't act as incentives anyway. Instead of profit, Soviet production was motivated by output targets, or quotas, like the examples on the screen that were reported by a British ambassador to Moscow. Take a minute to read through the excerpts. Notice that the ministers set goals in weight or number of units, for example, and the factory director was the one responsible for meeting them. The entire Soviet economy was a quota system, every factory and farm trying to reach a production target set by the ministry with oversight of that particular area of the economy. Now, because there were no labor markets, workers, managers, and factory directors were chosen or assigned by the ministries. The incentives for the director and his management team were in the form of bonuses. Fulfilling each component of the output plan carried a monetary reward for the management team. Awards and recognition were also used as incentives, not only for managers but also for workers. Medal ceremonies and banners to drape on factory walls were intended to confer status, and there's some indication that they were sometimes effective incentives. But as the economy stagnated under Brezhnev, they too became a focus of jokes and discontent. The bottom line is that the incentives were perverse. Factory directors weren't tied to consumers through profit, they were tied to output targets by their bonuses, and they predictably focused on the target rather than the product. The kind of unstated guideline for the factory director was, if it isn't measured, it can be sacrificed. The plan specifications were in gross targets, and whatever measurement unit was specified in the target became the goal. And this incentive is the genesis of the stories we find so ridiculous. If the plan targeted gross weight, heavy products were produced. Think lamps too heavy to lift or chandeliers that pulled down ceilings. Because making a few very heavy things was the quickest way to meet the target. If the plan targeted number of units, small, lightweight products were produced. Think mini light bulbs and baby shoes, but no lamp bulbs or adult-sized boots. And there were no controls on quality. After all, how do you measure quality? So it was almost always sacrificed in order to meet the target. Hence, shoddy was the Soviet chic. The first and most essential function of profit, then, to motivate the use of resources in their most valuable ways, is missing in the Soviet Union, replaced by the directives of the Communist Party leaders and the output targets of Gosplan, with bizarre but very predictable consequences that became the fodder of jokes. The second function of profit is to motivate entrepreneurs to innovate, both to reduce cost and to entice consumers with new and better products. Obviously, since factory managers had no control over what they produced, any innovation, were they so inclined to make one, would have had to be in the cost reduction area. And in any case, it doesn't matter. We shouldn't be surprised that they weren't so inclined. As a general rule, factory managers were hoarders, promoters of the status quo, and decidedly risk-averse. They had no incentive to be otherwise. Consider how the factory manager would regard cost. First, he has no control over production inputs. He's allocated resources with which to meet the target, and although he could request changes or additions, there's not a great likelihood that he would get a response. The result was that factory directors hoarded the resources they were allocated and enlisted the services of Tokachi to procure the supplies they needed to meet their quotas. The Tokachi has been described as shadowy characters that arose in response to universal shortages. They are people who have a network of personal connections enabling them to locate a source for virtually any item. They extensively use the black market in stolen state goods and are provided by their factory director clients with expense accounts to wine and dine and bribe anyone who can wrangle supplies. Often, Tokachi are freelancers employed by more than one company. They're never officially on any company's payroll, but are paid through ingenious juggling of accounts. Factory managers hoarded labor as well as supplies. Imagine, for example, a paint factory with a chemist in charge of the formulas and mixing processes. And the chemist complains of illness and starts to miss a great deal of work. Enough that the director worries about meeting the output target. His bonus is at stake. So he needs another chemist, but there are no labor markets. He requests budget from the ministry and is fortunate that they allow him to hire another chemist at the state-approved wage. So the director finds one, puts him to work, and then the sick chemist, no longer at death's door, shows up back at work. So now the factory manager has two chemists and only enough work for one. Does he release the second one, aware that skilled workers are in short supply throughout the economy? No way. He hoards him, keeping him around just in case. A late Soviet-era joke has a guide conducting an information/propaganda tour for Western journalists, and he proudly points out an immense factory, noting that the facility stretches more than a mile along the railroad line. When a duly impressed journalist exclaims, "Oh my goodness, that's huge! How many people work there?" the guide proudly responds, "About half of them." Which brings us to another problem faced by a factory manager. His workers' incentives were, if possible, more perverse than his. Workers were paid a state-determined wage, and there was no unemployment. That guarantee and the unpredictable conditions in factories, which were often idle because of supply shortages, undermined any worker motivation. "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us," was the cynical joke. Not surprisingly, all the propaganda slogans, medals, and ceremonies had little impact on the alcoholism, absenteeism, and workplace theft that was rampant in the Soviet urban labor population. Factory directors also had little control over capital allocated to their plants, and generally it was of extremely poor quality. As a result, they strove for self-sufficiency. It was common, for example, for factories to actually manufacture the component tools they needed to produce to their targets, and the spare parts that they needed to repair their own machinery. The goal of self-sufficiency was understandable, but it further contributed to the inefficiencies and perpetual shortages. All these uncertainties discouraged factory directors from assuming the risks that accompany innovation. New ideas and new processes threatened their ability to reach the output targets their bonuses depended on, and the system stagnated. A fictitious example helps us to track the thinking and behavior of the factory manager facing an incentive system of quotas and bonuses. Suppose that an ingenious young engineer figures out a way to combine several steps in production and to rearrange the factory floor so that the production process allows for smoother workflow. Because he's curious about whether his idea will work, there's certainly no other motivation than curiosity because it's not going to increase his pay. Anyway, he asks his cousin, the director, if he can try it, pointing out that, on paper at least, they'd be able to meet the yearly quota 2 weeks earlier than they have in the past. How does the director react? Well, in the first place, he doesn't see the need. They're on track to meet the quota, just like they have in the past couple years. So what's the advantage of meeting it earlier? Exceed the quota, the young engineer suggests. Well, certainly exceeding it a little bit looks good, but going over it by a lot? Are you nuts? They'll raise the quota for the next year, and then I'll be right back in the same problem. Directors worked hard to make sure that the ministry didn't know the true productive capabilities of their factories, inflating or ratcheting up their resource requirements and understating their capacity. Innovation threatened to upset the delicate balance they'd worked out and learned how to manage. But anyway, suppose the cousin persists, saying that they don't have to go over the quota, they can just meet it more easily. They don't have to brag about it. The factory director says, okay, that's a good point. Nobody ever knows what we're doing anyway. What would we have to do? The cousin replies, well, we just stop production for a week and rearrange the machinery. And then we slow production so that we take a quarter of the workers off the line every morning for a month until we get everyone trained. We'll make up the downtime easily after everybody's trained. And the factory manager thinks, but what if we don't? It's his bonus and his position on the line if things don't work out as planned. Weighing the costs and benefits, he decides, it's too risky. Better to stay with the devil you know than mess with the one you don't. And so it's back to same old, same old. It's important when looking at the results of using output targets to remember that the anti-innovative bent of Soviet factory directors is not an indictment of their intelligence. While the system, the economy, was inherently anti-innovation and incentives made individuals highly risk-averse, the Soviet people were not stupid or lacking in inventiveness. The important distinction to make is between invention, that is, new understanding or new ideas, and innovation, the application of the new knowledge to provide goods and services in the economy. We can see that the Soviet system provided incentives for one, but not for the other. The USSR invested heavily and successfully in education and in scientific and technological research, the space race being only one evidence of Soviet prowess. The difference between the USSR and the market economies of the West is that inventions in the Soviet military and government sectors never moved into the consumer sector. By contrast, there's a long history of successful interaction between research facilities and commercial enterprises in market economies like the United States. NASA, for example, maintains a full website to showcase and encourage spin-offs, products developed in space exploration, that have been successfully commercialized, from freeze-dried orange juice we all know as Tang, to interactive computer games, to medical breakthroughs. Now, here's an example from the end of the Cold War that shows how different incentives produce different outcomes from invention. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the USSR wanted to station submarines under the polar ice cap that could launch missiles through the ice to Moscow and Washington, D.C. respectively, shortening the response time by comparison to land-based missile launches. One obstacle was that launching through the ice tended to damage the missile fins, making them directionally unreliable. The Soviets were the first to solve this problem, developing a scandium alloy that was 10% stronger than the metals being used. Just as the Cold War was ending, they were also experimenting with the scandium alloy in the wings of fighter jets. Now, the first point of this example is that the Soviet scientists were up to the inventive task. The second point is that, unlike freeze-dried astronaut food to consumer drink, Soviet inventions didn't cross over from the military into commercial use. The potential was always there, but the incentives worked. And then, in 1991, the institutional rules of the game changed. The incentives changed, and the outcome changed. Here's the rest of the story. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became independent, the scandium miners began to look for a non-military use, so they'd continue to have a livelihood. They shopped their scandium alloy to airplane manufacturers like Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Israeli Aircraft. No takers. But they didn't stop there and broadened their search. Eventually, they sold the alloy to the Easton Bat Company that launched the Red Line bat for recreational baseball and softball leagues, a crossover that couldn't have taken place in the Soviet Union because there was no incentive to motivate turning the invention into an innovation. There wasn't an entrepreneur. Today, the scandium alloy remains an important innovation in recreational equipment, increasing strength and reducing weight in such things as racing bicycle frames. Again, it's important to stress that the lesson here is about incentives, not character. Economic reasoning proposition number 3 asserts that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. The implication being that if the incentives that faced Soviet factory directors and workers were transferred to another society, we would see the same types of behavior emerge. And in fact, we have examples within our own economy to use as evidence. The ratchet effect in military supply procurement, and the infamous inefficiencies of government offices like the Department of Motor Vehicles would be good places to start. In summary then, several key points. First, production in the Soviet Union was not the result of entrepreneurship, but of centralized direction, and this makes all the difference. The incentives for the factory managers responsible for production were output targets, not the profit that motivates entrepreneurs in market economies. Directors, therefore, were generally risk-averse and unmotivated to innovate. We should add, however, as a qualifier, that the shortcomings of the official system produced an active black market, in which Soviet people displayed all the traits we associate with entrepreneurship: self-direction, willingness to risk, and innovation. Perverse incentives also reduced output by encouraging shirking among the workforce. And finally, incentives, not character, best explain the behavior of Soviet factory directors and workers that led to the poor quality and chronic shortages of output. If we look at the condition of our three-legged stool as we move into the 80s, it seems to be holding up fine. But seems is an important word here. The political legal leg is still strong, and we know that under Brezhnev, the Soviets were pouring resources into keeping it that way. Investing at a level we'll discover in the 80s they couldn't maintain. The economic leg is weak, but the economy does continue to grow, although the oil windfall created an exaggerated impression to the outside world. and beguiled the party leadership into ignoring underlying economic problems. But none of that is new. What is new is the appearance of microscopic cracks in the moral-cultural leg, the buy into the system. Cracks that express themselves in the dissent of writers and intellectuals, but more importantly, in the jokes and grumbling as the Soviet people began to laugh ruefully at their own system. In 1984, the good old boys are gone, and the stage is set for a new era of leadership. That ends the lecture material for Lesson 3. After you've finished the readings and assignments, we'll take a side journey in Lesson 4 to examine in more detail the perennial headache for Soviet leadership, the so-called farm problem, that plagued every premier from Lenin to Gorbachev. And then in Lesson 5, we'll come back to look at life in a Soviet household and follow the history of the USSR until its end in 1991.